You're listening to Daily Paul Radio. Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. WGRR Digital.
She got my key, and she knows how to use it. Your late night highly caffeinated host, the one and only smoking artist, Allison Bricker.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Allison Bricker Show here on Daily Paul Radio. You can check us out over at dailypaulradio.com. Today is Wednesday free sign-up, so if you would like to interact with the show but aren't really comfortable calling into a live call-in show, today is the day where you can sign up over at dailypaul.com for a free account, and then you just simply click the button in the lower left-hand corner, and you enter the chat room, and then you can interact with the show, ask questions. If you have a question for tonight's guest, who is the one and only Ben Swann, which is amazing, you can do so via the chat room. We're going to be joined here shortly by Ben Swann, as many of you, I'm sure you're familiar with his reality checks. And then, of course, now benswann.com, probably the brightest mind that we have in the liberty movement, because I have to tell you, looking over his bio, it's rather impressive. Did you have any idea? Because I didn't until, and he doesn't really tout it, right? But reading his biography, Ben Swann earned his master's in history at age 16, which, being a history nerd, I am completely and utterly impressed by that singular fact alone. Also, Ben Swann was the first journalist to confront Obama on his kill list, and many of you may have seen that video where Obama was, of course, being the politician that he is and evading the question, but Ben had the guts to go forward and ask President Barack Obama about his kill list. Of course, Ben Swann's Truth in Media project has already developed a massive, massive following, over 138,000 people on Facebook between his two pages, 35,000 Twitter followers, 10 million plus YouTube video views, 42,000 YouTube subscribers, 18,000 newsletter recipients. That's a pretty impressive list, I should say. As well, of course, you can check out his main site, benswann.com. There's, I believe, 12 episodes available currently from the first season, in addition to all the different articles that are published over at Ben Swann. Mr. Swann, thanks so much for coming on the Allison Bricker Show. It is such an honor and a pleasure to have you with us.
It's very kind of you to have me on. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, I was just, I'm a history nerd, and when Zach had sent me over your biography, and it said that you had received your master's in history at 16, I must say that I was floored. Were you just always interested in history from a young age, or was it something that your parents kind of imbued to you throughout your childhood?
Yeah, that was really more my parents who pushed that on me. It really wasn't my particular interest at the time. I actually found myself becoming much more interested in history over the years, though I will say when I was getting my master's, I really focused on Cold War and McCarthyism. And at the time, I was so kind of confused by a lot of the political climate of that time and how easily the population seemed to be manipulated. And yet here we are today, and I'm not sure we haven't come full circle.
Absolutely right. I mean, because it's always said that those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it. And I mean, all the way back to Madison, warning us of the permanent standing army, that it's more often to use to oppress liberty domestically under the guise of slaying monsters abroad. I just had Michael Swanson on, author of The War State, and you were very correct in your assessment. This is what they do time and time again, whether it was the Cold War or, of course, now the War on Terror. It just seems to repeat ad nauseum.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And the reality is that media at the time, really since the beginning of media in the world, has always been used to manipulate the masses. Certainly in the United States, we see that that's been the case. And I think really in the last 100 years, I mean, if you go back to the early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson was really, truly excellent, for lack of a better term, at manipulating media and using media in order to control the way the public viewed things. And his ability to utilize propaganda was pretty stunning. I think we are in a place today where, we're right back there. The only difference is this little thing called the internet sure does even the playing field just a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, I'm over here in Indiana, but I became aware of you while you were in Cincinnati thanks to YouTube. To me, this is the Gutenberg press of the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think is so remarkable is that a guy working at a Fox station in Cincinnati who's doing a little local news segment can suddenly be reaching people in 140 countries and have 10 million views on YouTube. And it only happens because of the ability that people have, number one, to get information through the internet, but then to spread it through social networks. And, I really sat back in awe of what was happening and was amazed by it. And I still am. I mean, the fact that we were able to impact so many people. And I think in many ways that becomes the Achilles heel for the political system, the two-party political system that we have in place right now that's entrenched, the control that governments have over their people, certainly this warfare state that we live in, the welfare warfare state that we live in. I think that we start to see cracks in all of that because of the internet, because of the ability for people to share and to gather information so easily.
It absolutely is a revolution. I don't think they understood when DARPA handed it over to the colleges in the 80s for research purposes. I don't think they understood what it eventually would become. They completely underestimated Steve Jobs, who saw the potential of what internetworking computers would bring to us. And now I started watching your reality checks prior to you confronting President Obama on his kill list. But I have to know, were you at all nervous as a journalist? Were you nervous to ask the President of the United States the question regarding the fact that he's assassinated American citizens and his answer?
I really wasn't nervous about asking him. My only nerves, when you go into that setting, you have such a limited amount of time. They basically are telling you got 5 minutes, and when you have a politician, and really all politicians do it, but politicians who filibuster because they really want to take their time and let you get as few questions in as possible. My only nerves were how many questions do I get to get in here, because I had a bunch of them that I wanted to go over. Obviously, in my opinion, the most important was the one on the kill list. And Al-Qaeda in Syria. And by the way, when I asked that question about the fact that the U.S. was funding and supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria, nobody was talking about that at that time. I remember getting ripped by my bosses when I got back to the station about why would you ask this crazy conspiratorial question? There is no Al-Qaeda in Syria. They were so upset about this idea. So it was just, it was really kind of an interesting thing. But for me, it really came down to this. I was trying to ask questions, not so much even as a journalist at that moment, but more questions as a father, as a husband, as a citizen of the United States. I wanted to know about this power because, candidly, there have been many journalists who have had the chance to interview the president. And up until that moment, nobody had bothered to ask him about this and confront him about it. How do you, as a constitutional attorney, how do you, as the president of the United States, regardless of party or person, believe you have the power to assassinate U.S. citizens without due process? It's one of the most fundamental questions of our time, and nobody was asking it. And to me, it was shameful that reporters who had access to this president had not asked that question.
I couldn't agree with you more. Ladies and gentlemen, we're speaking with the one and only Ben Swann of benswann.com. We're going to take a short commercial break here, and we'll be right back. You're listening to The Allison Bricker Show here on Daily Paul Radio. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Allison Bricker Show here on Daily Paul Radio. Getting a couple notes from my audio engineer. The stream is being absolutely hammered. So if you're having difficulty accessing the stream, please click the Listen via iTunes link right below the player, and you should have, as long as you have iTunes, yes, I realize it's bloated, but you should be able to access the stream via there. We're speaking with Ben Swann. Ben, thanks so much for hanging on over the break. So when you were doing the reality checks, what was the impetus to move on to do the Ben Swann Truth and Media project? Were you getting pushback from your editors, or was it you just wanted to kind of branch out and do what you wanted to do?
Well, I think we reached a point. When I was doing reality check, the idea was that I was pretty much given carte blanche to do what I wanted. It was probably a very smart move on the station's end and a very dumb move because the smart idea was, look, the station when I went in there was a third, almost fourth place station in the market. They didn't have much to lose. Because we caught on, we were growing so fast and we did so well, it was a stroke of genius. Everybody was excited. The problem is when you give someone the freedom to do what they want and it's working, and yet you don't really like what they're doing, how do you deal with that? So it took them about 2 years to finally come back and say, you know what, we like what you're doing, but, and you got to, what is it from Pee-wee's Big Adventure? You remember that movie?
Absolutely, yes. Large Marge.
He says, there's always a big but. In this case, the big but was, but we really want you to focus on local, Cincinnati only issues. And by the way, we argued about a lot of things. And one of the things I argued about was, hey, if the president has a list on which he can place citizens and kill them without due process, that's a Cincinnati issue because Cincinnati is not free from that list, anybody living here. So that's an issue that affects us. So we just had a difference in terms of our point of view of, stories that people were interested in. And, that's when I decided, you know what, I just want to do something bigger here. And I don't want to stay focused on, streetcars and city council meetings. I want to be able to talk about issues that I think are very important right now. And so, the opportunity came up to leave. And so that's what I wanted to do. Excellent.
Well, now let me ask you, when they said we want you to concentrate more on Cincinnati stories, was this an example of you turning lemons into lemonade when you uncovered the IRS scandal all the way back to the Cincinnati office?
Well, the funny thing was we had already agreed on all this, and we had already agreed that I was leaving, and everything was in place. It was actually 90 days out from June 1st is when we made the agreement, and then 30 days out from June 1st was when that story broke. Now, I had actually broken that story a year before, reporting on it and talking about Tea Party groups in Ohio who were saying they were being targeted by the Cincinnati office. And people thought I was crazy and said I was a conspiracy theorist, and that's not happening. These people are all nuts. Then we've when it broke that this had actually happened, that was my last 30 days at the station, and so what a great 30 days to be able to just go and go after that story, and we really led the nation on that story, breaking all kinds of angles on it. That it was not just local Cincinnati agents, that there was this entire paper trail that went up to Cindy Thomas and Lois Lerner. And by the way, and for the record, too, this is an important issue because still to this day, no one has been charged with a crime here. Not one single IRS agent, not one single manager, no higher-ups. Nobody has been charged with any civil rights infringements, and these are clearly civil rights infringements that were taking place. No one's been charged with anything.
Well, absolutely. The government is more concerned, I think, with concentrating on those traitors, in quotes, like Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, as they've intimated, and instead of actually holding elected officials and public servants accountable. I mean, when I grew up in government school, I remember having it beat into my head that no one was above the law. That was what separated us. And yet it just seems, whether it's the Bush torture memo or all the way through today with Lois Lerner, government officials seem to be above the law anymore, and the rest of us are subject to the whims, somewhat arbitrary whims, of the current regime in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're seeing all over the country right now. And yes, it is a incredibly important issue. And when you consider the fact that we have in this nation, as you said, politicians and lawmakers and bureaucrats who are considered above the law, no matter what they do, they're not being charged with crimes. And so, we talk a lot about separation of powers in this country, but one of the things that we now, I think, need to start to recognize is that we need a separation of law enforcement. So, for instance, you have a Justice Department who is tasked with taking on exactly these kinds of issues, and yet they're political appointees. They're not going to go after an administration. Eric Holder is not going to investigate the IRS. That very likely was ordered by this White House, this administration, to target these political groups. He's not going to do it. And I think Americans know that. I think we understand it. but what's the solution to it? And at some point, we've got to come up with a strategy, I think, by which we create a separation of powers when it comes to law enforcement and the ability to be able to enforce the rights of the people and create separation here from this growing bureaucratic state.
I couldn't agree with you more. So where would you classify yourself then? Do you consider yourself a libertarian, an anarchist? Where are you on the political spectrum?
Well, in the truest sense of the word, I would say I'm an anarchist. And
right on.
The reason for that is but you have to go back to the true definition of anarchy. I'm not the Molotov cocktail, throw it through the window, create chaos guy. I don't see true anarchists as chaotic at all. In fact, to me, they're the most organized because you're creating a system where people have strong communities, build those communities together, and they don't need one central power structure to oversee their lives. Whether or not we'd ever see that in this society, I don't think so. So I would say I'm a lowercase libertarian. I'm not registered in the Libertarian Party. I'm a lowercase libertarian. Definitely a liberty-minded constitutionalist above all else. And I believe in the rule of law, and I believe in individual natural rights. And I think people are entitled to those rights. Absolutely.
So when you say anarchy, the same as myself, you're not referring to the often quoted misnomer of chaos. You're more talking to the Greek etymology of no rulers, basically, and that definition of anarchy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is, and I think that's what the founders and framers really wanted. I obviously they didn't, construct a system that was exactly that. But I think in their minds, that was the best system. I mean, the republic that they constructed, they didn't see that as a perfect system. They saw that as the best, worst system out there. And that was essentially what they constructed, right? Was a constitutional republic over which the local government and had the most power. The state government, had less. The federal government had the least. But actually, and this goes back to an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, the founders and framers constructed a system where the individual, again, through jury nullification, has the power to override all laws. And so they really tried to place the most authority in the individual and in communities themselves, not in bureaucrats, not in lawmakers. I mean, ultimately, we as individuals have rights and authority that trumps everything, but our system is completely upside down.
Absolutely. And when we come back from the bottom of the hour news, I want to talk to you about that system and perhaps what is considered by many to be the last emergency brake to save this constitutional republic. And I can't remember who Mr. Jefferson had addressed the letter to, but he did speak to anarchy as being the most perfect system, but that the republic would be the only, as again referring to Madison, angels are not men are not angels, that we would have to deal with a republic system in order to offer the most liberty to the most people. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking to Ben Swann here on the Allison Bricker Show, and we'll continue after the bottom of the hour news. Check us out over at dailypaul.com. You can click and listen to the stream just by clicking on the button in the upper right-hand corner. You don't even have to log in. We'll be right back after the bottom of the hour news. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Allison Bricker Show, broadcasting live here on Daily Paul Radio from the Constitution Free Zone. We're speaking with Ben Swann from the Ben Swann, of course, Truth and Media Project. Mr. Swann, thanks for hanging on over the bottom of the hour news. Now, you had talked about nullification, to which I am a big fan of, also interposition. So I wanted to ask you I used to work for a man named Mike Church on Sirius Satellite XM, who years ago, along with Professor Gutzman, would advocate what is called an Article 5, also referred to as a con-con.
Right.
And Marc Levin would come out and would just completely bash the both of them. He would spend days upon days upon days taking to Facebook to bash the stupidity and of calling Dr. Tom Woods an outlier. It was really ugly. Now we see Marc Levin has come around to an Article 5. But now you're not really sold on the notion, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that an Article 5 is really the proper way to go.
Well, yeah, because and there are a lot of folks who are a lot smarter than I am who are weighing in on this. So, by no means am I the expert, though I am trying to reach out to more experts to really understand this concept. But look, one of the concerns that's been brought up by Michael Lotfi over at 10th Amendment Center, who also writes for benswann.com, as well as some other folks, is this concern that if you call an Article 5 con, what you're going to end up with is Congress is the one who ultimately has to call it. Now, you have to get a certain number of states, right, who are able to, move this thing forward, but then Congress actually calls it and at the same time selects the delegates. That's what a number of folks are saying. And if that is the case, then what Levin has been saying, which is that you cannot, according to Levin, the states are the ones who are going to choose the delegates, so we can't go wrong. But that's not what a lot of the experts here are saying. They're saying, no, that's not true, that Congress will ultimately choose the delegates who will then be able to come together and create these amendments. And so the states won't be as part of the process, as much a part of the process as guys like Levin are saying. So, I don't know all the answers to it, but I think that before we get all the way down that road, we need to know exactly what we're getting into. And so I've actually been reaching out to a couple of folks who I think really are experts on this subject to try to get confirmation from them one way or the other, because I want to know. And my concern is this: I have no confidence in the U.S. Congress. I have no confidence in Republican or Democratic congressional representatives to choose folks who are not bought and paid for by lobbyists to ultimately come in and write amendments to the Constitution. And that, I think, would be just a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. From my understanding, and this is again from Mike Church, Professor Kevin Gutzman, who wrote the end-all be-all article biography on James Madison, and Bruce Fine, Congress does in fact get to call the time, manner, and place of when the convention would take place. But in fact, the states are responsible for selecting their delegates. And I do believe this is to be the case simply because I heard a state senator from my state, Indiana, David Long. He was on the Peter Schiff show last week saying the states, I believe they're 2 states away from calling a constitutional convention. And believe it or not, all the states that have passed these resolutions, they met in November and December already, right? In Virginia and in Washington, D.C. to start setting up the rules of what would be discussed, how the delegates would be selected, and whether or not the option of recall by the states, basically reimposing a 17th Amendment restriction on the delegates, which I have to say that I was kind of surprised. I had no idea that 30 state legislatures had sent members to start drafting rules for an Article 5 convention. I didn't realize we were really that close. And to go one step further than your lack of faith, no confidence in Congress, I have to tell you, if Senator David Long is in charge, at least from the state of Indiana, I'm not sure I even have faith in the states that they'll send delegates that aren't bought and paid for.
Right. No, I agree. Look, I'm looking at some of what's been sent to me about this. My understanding is states hold the convention, right, which Article 5 allows for. They reject and they ratify amendments that are proposed by Congress. So if Congress, chooses to allow that mode to happen, but again, this is all proposed by Congress, not by the states. So my understanding, again, and it's not just me, from what I'm being told, is that the states are not the ones who are going to be proposing the amendments. The Congress will propose the amendments.
We'll have to find out the answer to this for sure, but wouldn't that be kind of counterproductive? I mean, if they were the ones that proposed the amendments, why wouldn't Congress just pass out the amendments through the regular amendatory process?
Well, because I don't know. I don't know. I mean, again, this is just what I'm being told, right?
Absolutely, right.
So again, here's how it says it. In this convention, states get to choose their delegates, but only within state lines. Okay? What Mark Levin is claiming is that the founders supported that the states have the power to run the convention. But that's not true. They don't have the power to run the entire convention. So, again, my understanding here is that Congress calls the convention for proposing amendments. States apply to Congress so that the amendments may be proposed. Congress proposes the amendments upon application. So again, I think it's really important, though, that we understand this process. And again, this is a process that we haven't gone through in a very long time in this country.
Absolutely.
So,
the last time that it occurred, at least the threat, and I just confirmed this from Professor Gutzman, the last time that a constitutional convention was threatened was in fact over prohibition and the repeal of the 18th Amendment, which of course then Congress acted and gave us the 21st, which resulted in the repeal of prohibition. But apparently, according to Professor Kevin Gutzman, the last time it was threatened to be initiated by the states was during prohibition and because of all of the violence and black market that, of course, alcohol prohibition had caused.
Right. Absolutely. As you're pointing out, it's been a very long time. And the reality is this, that Levin makes it sound like that the states are running the show. And so suddenly we're going to have this great system in place where the states are able to come in and say, we're going to, essentially create constitutional amendments that are going to force Congress and force the president and force the executive branch to follow rule of law. And again, my understanding is that the state's involvement is limited. The thing you got to watch out for is when you call an Article 5 convention, when you begin this process, you don't know what you're going to get. The last few amendments that have been added to the Constitution, now obviously you're talking about when you go to the repeal of prohibition, that's a positive. But how about just before that and when we got prohibition in the first place?
Yeah,
what about when we got the income tax? I mean, we have a number of things in this country's history where just because you're opening up the door to say, well, let's strengthen the Constitution does not mean you'll strengthen it. We have a Congress of the United States right now that does not support the Fourth Amendment, that does not believe that the United States is required to give due process to its citizenry. We have a Congress, whether Republican or Democratic, we have a Congress that believes that essentially your Second Amendment rights are not your rights, that there's a greater good concept that's more important, because they always use the argument, well, we have to have some restrictions. They use the argument, we have to have some restrictions on Fourth Amendment. We have to have some restrictions on free speech. Over and over, it doesn't matter what side of the left-right paradigm they fall on, Congress believes that your rights are not really yours. They are progressives in that they believe in a greater good concept. And I would even go further than that. I would say, and I get in trouble here, but I would say that the Congress of the United States is fascist in they believe in this corporatism, right?
Yes.
Corporatism being that there is a greater good concept, and any right that you believe you fundamentally hold from God or from nature is not yours if it interferes with either the comfort level, the security, the overall wellness of the masses. So your individual rights are always trumped by the masses. It doesn't matter, again, if they're Republicans or Democrats. It is a fascist belief system that they've begun to adopt. And you want to trust those guys to add amendments to the Constitution.
Well, that's why I'm not even sure I want to. Like I said, with one of my state senators, Senator David Long out of Fort Wayne, Indiana, being in charge of the Indiana delegation, that I have to tell you, that doesn't give me a whole lot of faith. And the man he does not understand the proper role of government. He's a Republican, but he does not grasp nature. He doesn't understand that the Bill of Rights was not a grant of liberty from the government. This concept is obviously foreign to him, based even on his legislation that he's posed on the state level. These people, as you are speaking, they don't believe that nature or nature's God gave us these rights. They believe that the Bill of Rights serves as a grant of liberty from the government. And that's the total antithesis, if you read Madison, Jefferson, even Hamilton on a very good day, that no, the minute we're born and we take our first breath, these are our natural rights, that no government prior to the Constitution or after the Constitution has any jurisdiction whatsoever to adjudicate these types of rights. And this is something that's never discussed, the difference between natural rights and civil rights. Civil rights are rights that are granted de jure by a government or a judicial fiat. And they seem to think, as you rightly point out, they seem to think every single liberty that is ours by birth is really a civil right. And I see that reinforced through my son's history school textbooks, that they don't delineate between the two.
No, they don't. And you're absolutely right in that. I give you a great example of where you can always see the paradigm shift there. And that is whenever a politician, regardless of whether, again, they're Republican or Democrat, left or right, doesn't matter, but they always seem to believe when you talk about terrorism, when you talk about what's going on overseas, when you talk about torture, when you talk about due process for someone in another country, bring up those issues. And what do they always say? Well, those people aren't entitled to due process because the Constitution doesn't extend to them. The Bill of Rights doesn't extend to them. Well, wait a minute. That's not true, because if you read the Bill of Rights, these are inalienable rights that are endowed upon us by our Creator. If you don't believe in a Creator, then they come from nature. But here's the point. They're not American rights. The American Bill of Rights and Constitution and Declaration merely looks at rights that are already in existence, and it recognizes them. It doesn't create them. And that's the problem that you have today, is you have this core belief, regardless of which side of the spectrum they fall on, that exactly what you just said, that these rights have been granted to you as a citizen of this country. And they were somehow created by the founders who thought them up, who wrote them out, and by putting, pen to paper, they breathed life into these rights. It is exactly what you said, the exact antithesis of any of our founding documents. And media is really to blame, I think, more than anyone. The public education doesn't help, but media is really to blame, I think, because it has played along with this, and people just don't know. They really think that these rights belong to us as Americans, that somehow the flag of the United States grants me these rights. Come on.
Absolutely. Well, God, we're coming up on the top of the hour, but so let me ask you this: on the second season of the Truth in Media Project, is an Article 5? Is that something that you'll be investigating?
Well, I don't know how much time we'll have to get to it before it actually happens, if it happens. And so, I would love to be able to do that. Hopefully we can do that and we can get that done. I think that's a really important thing for us to look at. I just want to say real quick, a friend of mine who's a constitutional lawyer was talking to me about this, and he said, I think this is something that needs to happen. I think it's going to be great. And I just posed a question to him: how do you know Congress won't run it? And if Congress runs it, is it a problem? And he said, if Congress runs it, it's a huge problem. He says, if Congress runs it, we can't have this. And I said, then do you feel that you know that Congress won't run it? He says, no, I guess I don't know. Well, if you don't know, then we're in a whole lot of trouble if we get all the way down that road and find out that Congress is going to run it.
Absolutely. And to your point, we have a couple more minutes, but to your point on the fascism, you won't get in any trouble here on this show, or I wouldn't think with any of the hosts that are on the Daily Paul Radio Network, because to me, the whole creation of the regulatory state is the embodiment of fascism. You have these regulators tasked with regulating industries, even if it's media. These are the very same regulators that worked for these companies that are raising barriers to entry and providing like a protected, not a monopoly, but an oligopoly for these specific companies. And if that isn't the definition of fascism, I'm at a loss of what would be fascism.
Well, and remember too, there is a misrepresentation of fascism. I think that we have in right now in our culture. The whole freedom to fascism concept that Mussolini had talked about, corporatism, right? And that's actually misinterpreted a lot of times. Corporatism, as Mussolini described it, was not exclusively government and corporations, meaning businesses. Corporatism was this idea of the corporate entity that is the people, the population, right? And so the idea is this: are we fascists in this country? Well, if you say that the greater good wins out, you're a fascist. And I'll show you how. When the U.S. Supreme Court says you have a right to private property unless there is a greater good that can be used from that property, and then a city council, county commission, state, federal government, whoever it is, a government entity can then take your land through eminent domain because it has a greater value to the greater good. That's exactly what Mussolini was describing when he talked about corporatism. He also believed in the right of individuals to own property so long as the state couldn't find a better way to use it. But if the state can find a better way to use it, if the corporate group of people together can use it better, then it's a better system. So go ahead and take it. That's what we have today. And so when people so often misinterpret fascism as being Jew-hating or Nazi-loving, and the interesting thing about fascists, George Orwell wrote a lot about this, and he had some really interesting things to say about it. But he says one of the most difficult things about fascism is that it's different in every place. It's different in Italy as it was in Germany. And he talked about different countries where there was fascism and did a beautiful job of saying that fascism is such a hard thing to nail down that no one really knows what it is. But if you go back to what Mussolini, who created it, said it was, it really is about the greater good concept. And so I believe that we should all be striving for a greater good, but that comes through individuals, not through mob rule.
Absolutely. And this just brings us all right back to Wilson. It's the logical fallacy of the appeal to majority. And what I call 101 years ago now, in 1913, this was the bloodless coup, right? I mean, we had the 16th Amendment, income tax, the 17th Amendment, which was the final abolition of any check on federal power through the states. And then we had the Federal Reserve to collateralize all the income tax. And then we got Madison's we transitioned from this Republican form of government to this mob rule. 51% can take away the property of the other 49. And we got the much feared, that Madison warned us about, democracy. And that's where we are now. This whole concept of I can steal from you to benefit because you obviously have too much and more than your fair share to give health care, to give food, to give housing, to give yada, yada, yada to someone else is this is the concept that the founding generation warned implicitly for us to avoid. And here we are in 2014, and we have completely become the absolute opposite of the revolution.
And what drives me just crazy is how you get people who talk all the time about socialism. You know, they talk about, oh, we're becoming socialist and Obama's a socialist and socialism. Listen, we've been socialists since the early 1900s. Why are we acting like socialism's new? Socialism's been in this country for over 100 years. And that's not always a bad thing. It's always a bad thing when it comes from government. But socialism in and of itself, if it's voluntary, is not bad. But what we've done is we paint socialism as this terrible thing, and then we don't ever talk about, again, this fascist state that ultimately says the state rules everything and controls everything, and you're allowed your little piece. You can have it so long as we don't need it. If we need it, we'll come and take it from you. But you can have your little scraps to get by, and that's where we are right now. I think we have to break through that fascist system, and we also have to break through the crony system where government and corporations are working so closely together, hand in hand, and essentially preventing anyone else from being able to have a shot at developing either industry, business, whatever it might be. We have to break that hold because it is choking to death the American economy.
Without question. And that's, I guess, for my final question then, I'm a big supporter of the End the Fed movement, but I've recently become enlightened to the notion I don't want to wait for the magical libertarian Congress to get elected and to then, of course, grant us this, half-baked audit, which we can't even still look at the private bank's bank. What do you think of the concept of we end the Fed by ignoring the Fed through the use of Bitcoin, right? Because I don't know if you're familiar with the notion of the Bitcoins Not Bombs charity drive they had over Christmas, where Angie Keaton from antiwar.com and Davey Barker, they all got together and they literally purchased tangible, real goods in the form of hoodies in exchange solely for Bitcoin to pass out to the homeless of San Francisco. And it dawned on me at the moment, I kind of see the David and God picture. But at that moment where that transaction took place, there was no Federal Reserve note involved in that transaction. And what do you think of the concept of people moving to Bitcoin away from the dollar as a strategy to basically end the Fed?
Yeah, I love Bitcoin. I'm a huge fan of it. I know there are some people who are wary of it. I think you have to be wary of all things. But one thing I love about Bitcoin is I see it as a true free market system. Bitcoin rises and Bitcoin crashes, and it's volatile. But I love it. I really do. I love the idea that you have true transactions between people the government's not involved in right now. But they're going to come for it at some point. So I like it straight off the bat. I think it's great, this idea from the get-go. But how do you protect it? And that's what I'm concerned about, is at what point are we able to protect these whether they be economies that are being built up in the private sector? That's the real question, is how do you keep government out of it because they believe they're entitled to all of it?
They so believe they're entitled to all of it, and they only allow us to keep just a portion of our wages. Well, Ben, we're coming to the end of this hour, and I cannot thank you enough for coming on the Allison Bricker Show. I hope you'll be amenable to coming back onto the show sometime in the future, and really look forward to beginning running your 3 minutes at the bottom of the hour, because you're going to be putting those out daily. Am I understanding that correctly?
We're going to do them 3 days a week starting next week. That's right.
Awesome. Well, we very much look forward to it. Thank you so much for coming on, and what's the best way to keep in touch with you? Are you more Twitter or Facebook or the website itself?
Listen, Facebook is killing me right now. Facebook is doing this whole thing where they're preventing people from seeing your page.
Yes.
So go to Twitter, Ben Swann _, and you can find me on Twitter. Go there. Or on, you can also go to benswann.com and sign up for the email list, and we'll email you stories every single day. But I'm going to start trying to work to get around Facebook because, a lot of folks have built their business on Facebook's property, and now the landlord's being a jerk. So there's nothing you can do. It's their property, right?
Right
so
on.
It's time to start working around those guys. I'm getting fed up with them.
Sounds like a good plan. Well, Ben, thanks again. I am already signed up for the newsletter every morning. Thanks again for coming on, and I will get you a link both to Ben, to the lawyer, Ben Fine and Kevin Gutzman regarding Article 5 in case you want to do anything more into it. And
Please.
Thanks again. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Allison.
Bye-bye. That was the interview with Ben Swann. We're coming up on the top of the hour news. We'll talk about the movement afoot in California to break the state up into 6 separate entities. You're listening to the Allison Bricker Show here on Daily Paul Radio.